of speakers from the ISGS Hong Kong. If anyone has to go or you want to watch it again, it will be there. So for that, we will probably be editing the video at the very end, so the Q&A part will be out of the video. So remember, why do you gesture? Let me tell you where I come to the field of gestures, or where I come from. I study foreign language acquisition, and I look at it from a cognitive linguistics point of view. And within cognitive linguistics, I specifically look at these post-speech gestures from a Magnelian point of view. So I believe in the growth point, the idea that speech and gesture and thought form one unity. So for those of you not familiar with cognitive linguistics, very basic principle is that organisms learn through the interactions through our body with the environment. These interactions through our senses allow us to pick up information that is then processed. In humans, this processing also leads to categorizations and logical connections between some of those pieces of information, to the extent that we are able to link up concrete ideas with abstract ones, and gesture also helps us here. The ideas of McNeill that I just mentioned, so this unity between the gesture, the speech, and the thought, make a lot of sense within embodiment. Basically, if you think that your thought is also affected by your previous experiences, your previous bodily experiences, it makes sense that as that thought develops, it is also going to be affected by the previous experiences. And as you externalize it, as you share the thought, you are also going to be using some of those experiences through your hands. So the thought is externalized via speech, gesture, both of them, or maybe just one or the other, depending very often on the context. Now, this idea of the link between gesture and the thought is amazing for foreign language acquisition people like myself, because it means that as we observe our learners' gesture, we might get an inkling of what it is that they're thinking. We might get an inkling of whether the concept that we are trying to explain to them in this new language has been grasped, whether it has been done so correctly or not. And then the other thing is, when they actually externalize those thoughts with proficiency, can we actually see a correlation between proficiency and thought? So basically, can we use gesture to evaluate proficiency? So this is one of the questions. So if you want more information about, or if you want to learn a little bit more about cognitive linguistics and how it is applied within foreign language acquisition, I've given you a QR code of a publication at the top, so you can just scan it. Hopefully you should have free access to it. Let me know if not. So going back to gestures, as I said before, I'm talking about post-speech gestures, and these are movements of the body that carry meaning. And meaning, this is quite an important concept here. It is thought to be a universal phenomenon. So we are still to find a culture that does not gesture. And we have, over the last 40 years or so of research, we have identified two major functions of the gesture. One is cognitive, for me as a speaker, to help me think, and the other one is communicative, for you, my interlocutor, to understand better, or for me to ensure that you understand better what I'm saying. In most gesture studies, we tend to find a categorization that is based on McNeill's ideas again. So iconic gestures, the ictic, metaphoric, and beats. However, McNeill from the very beginning said that he did not mean for this categorization to be exclusive, so 4 types of gestures, but what he meant is that gestures have a nature that can be iconical, deictic, or metaphorical, or maybe stress-related, those beats. So this would be type of beat. However, as you can imagine, it is really, really difficult to do research and analyze a gesture when it might be all of four categories. Some of studies tend to concentrate on usually iconical gestures, although there is more and more research on the deictic ones, and of late a little bit of prosody and beat-related gesture studies. In addition to this, Ekman and Friesen back in '69 had also identified another set of movements that refer to soft touching. So for example, this sort of thing. These movements are usually referred to as adapters, and they are considered to be non-gestures because they don't carry meaning. And I'll tell you more about this in a minute. Before I do so, let me give you a couple of examples so you know what it is I'm talking about. So here I'm going to show you a video of Kamala Harris for a change, because it's usually Trump, so finally someone different. This is a recent video from the 29th of October. She's being interviewed and she's talking about stimulus checks specifically here. I want you to focus on her hand movements at the very beginning. Okay, I'm going to play it again, and now look at the rest of her body, because I've been talking about hand gestures, but gesture studies actually cover every movement of the body. So look at her head, at her body, and her foot. Whoops, sorry. And this is one of the reasons why gesture studies are so incredibly complicated, because the amount of information, even in this very, very short extract, is enormous. I'm just going to look at the very first 4 or 5 gestures. If you notice, she starts with her finger up. So this would be usually classified as a deictic gesture. Unfortunately, I cut the video a little bit too short. She says yes to start with. And that yes is actually referring to something that the interviewer had said before. So this gesture is a deictic one. She's referring to something said before, but it carries a discursive function, which is really important. And in many gesture studies, it would be completely lost. So we are looking at gestures also from a functional perspective. And if you want more information, you go to the QR code to an article that tells more. So going back to this gesture, then she says, that's why those checks. So again, you could argue deictic gesture. Well, think a little bit more about this. That's why those checks. She's actually linking up two things. And this gesture is also a discursive gesture, which carries a lot of pragmatic meaning. It's not that that's why it's important. What's important is that link between the causality that she's establishing. In those checks, okay, that could be just deictic, although it also carries stress elements, so there's a little bit of a beat. And then she comes back and says, remember, so again, a deictic gesture, but what she's doing here is she's opening a bracket in a conversation. She's again referring to something that has been said before. Could you please do that over there? She's saying, she's referring to something that has been said before. And so this is actually another discursive gesture. And then we go to this beautiful one that she does. Congress holds the purse. Obviously, Congress is not going around with a purse full of money. You know, this is money that is electronically in a bank or physically is not anywhere anymore. However, this is a use of a metaphor, and we see it reflected in the gesture. But this gesture also has an iconicity to it, because I think she's telling us how big this purse is, indicating how large it is. So as you can see, fairly complex. However, her gestures are very sharp. The image is very clear. She's a very good orator. She's obviously talking to an audience. This is not the sort of video that we deal with. what we deal with is completely different. Bad quality, mixed up signals, speech obviously not very clear half of the time. So let me give you an example. In this particular video, one of our participants is talking about the Tweety and Sylvester stories. You know, familiar with them. There's a cat and the bird. The cat is trying to get to the bird all the time, never manages to eat it. In this particular bit, the cat is entering a building that doesn't allow any cats or dogs and is kicked out. So let me play it for you. And again, concentrate on the gestures at the very beginning. Let me play it again. If we look at these gestures, they're not as clear as those that we have seen before. However, they still provide a lot of information. So first we have, what seems to be a clarification. Previously she has talked about animals, now she clarifies cats and dogs. We consider this a discursive gesture, providing this additional information, making a clarification. And then we've got a very interesting gesture because she says kicked out. Now, usually if you were to say kicked out, which way would your hand rotate? Yeah, it would usually rotate out. So why is hers rotating in? This is a question mark. We have assumed this is a representational gesture. There might be a lot more to this than we have assumed. And this is a problem that we encounter over and over in gesture studies. And then we have another one. She says, by the security guards. And she goes onto her finger, onto her thumb, sorry. Now, this could be considered an adapter, one of those gestures I mentioned before that carry no meaning. However, we are seeing this gesture in many of our participants and talking about different things. We don't think it's an adapter. What we are seeing is many micro gestures that are not defined enough for us to be able to say, yeah, this is obviously functioning as this or giving this meaning. So we have created this additional category that we call flatters, where we have put all of these gestures that seem to be connected to the prosody of the speech. However, we cannot definitely say, yeah, these are representational or discursive gestures. In this particular case, it's actually quite interesting because after she does by the security guards, she goes on to say, and then. And I am not showing it to you, but if you carry on listening to her speech, when she starts to describe the third event, she goes to the next finger. And then when she describes the fourth event, she goes to the fourth finger. What she's doing here, she's actually counting. So unless you really paying attention and very, very attuned, you would miss this altogether. Because these gestures are small. I mean, hers are pretty good, but we see a much micro gestures with many people. So, oh yeah, and then the adapters. So with the proper adapters, in this participant, you will see that she has one adapter at the very beginning. This is the very, very beginning of her narration, and she touches it there. And then there's another one in the middle. Did you see it? Yeah, she pushes her glasses up. Yeah. Okay, maybe her glasses are falling down. Maybe she had to push them up. Maybe. But adapters are usually thought to answer a bodily need. They could also be touching objects, or a shirt or the glasses in this case. We think that, or rather, the literature has told us that they are not related to meaning. Big question mark here. Because these gestures, these type of gestures at the very beginning of narrations happen over and over. in our participants, and even in the interactions when a person is preparing themselves to speak, we also see these adapters. So I disagree with this non-meaning related. We are doing more work on these type of issues. And then the other thing is, you notice how when she pushes her glasses up, she is actually saying, "Oh, I forget his name." So there's the cognitive disfluency at this particular point, and we again see this type of attackers with this type of cognitive disfluency. So they're still talking, they're still communicating, but there's obviously some sort of breakdown. They don't remember, they don't know what to say, they're looking for the right word. So the literature suggests that these gestures might be associated with stress, but whether they are a signal or a coping strategy, that is still to be resolved. So again, question marks there, and we're working on it. So I have already told you quite a number of reasons why we gesture. The two key ones are the function, whether a cognitive function or a communicative function. But then there are other things that affect also how much we gesture, how large those gestures are. And usually we can group them into three main areas. The ideas based on the embodiment, so our bodies, the relationship with the environment, previous experiences, more external factors such as the interlocutor, the task, the content sometimes as well, and culture and language. And then we have gender, personality, age, but all of these factors interplay. Our bodies and our experiences. So here, don't forget that many of our behaviors are genetically learned. And just to give you a very, very silly example, when we're afraid, or when an animal is afraid, they will cower, they will try to make themselves as small as possible. So is that shrug gesture coming from that natural instinct to make ourselves as small as possible, open our hands, show that we pose no threat? So Alan Tenke and Camille Debra mentioned that perhaps these are some of the reasons. And there are other links that relate these learned behaviors to our gestures. Mobility is, of course, really important. We know that as we age, our speech gets slower and our gestures also get slower, for example. As I mentioned before, over the last 4 years, we've been looking at the links between thought and gesture specifically. But recently, over the last 10 years or so, there's been, we've widened up that field, and now we're looking at other cognitive skills. So it is not just about the thought, we're also looking at perception, learning, memorizing, language, obviously, thinking, and off late, and this is really off late, the last few years, there's been more and more being said about emotion and motivation. Now, in second language acquisition, these ideas are not new. We've been talking about them for a very long time, and we know they affect our learners. So why wouldn't they affect gestures? We have not looked into that. These external things I was telling you about, the cognitive load, the heavier the load, the more gestures are expected. If the content is related to motoric objects, there is usually more gesture. If there is shared knowledge between the interlocutors, usually the gestures are not so many, not so strong, not so marked, because there's no need to make them salient. Visibility also impacts how we gesture. So even on the phone, we gesture, but in a different way than when we're talking to someone face to face, because the person that we're talking to also defines how we gesture. Especially in cultures where there's a hierarchy, deference plays a part. So that's familiarity, and this obviously connects to cultural norms. Confucius said, be careful with your hands because you might be giving out more information that you think or that you want through your hands. So in certain cultures, at certain times also, we see how the use of the hands might change. The other thing is concepts in certain cultures might exist which don't in others, or the concept might be slightly different, and this will also affect the gesture. And then we have language, the type of language, the order of the subject, verb, object might be affecting how we gesture. The content, the amount of content within the verb also affects how we gesture. We already know this. And one of the things that has not been studied, certainly not systematically, is what about the prosody? How do the languages with different prosodies affect the way that we gesture? And then, of course, language proficiency. So these are all of the things that affect gesture. And we wanted to try and control as many of these as possible, which is quite a task, to see specifically how does proficiency affect the gesture of our speakers. And so we designed a 2.5-year long study. We were talking to our participants every 6 months or so. And unfortunately, we started with COVID. So that meant that from the very beginning, we were online. We were lucky enough to get some participants face to face, but most of them were online, which also affects how we gesture. For the proficiency, we asked 3 professional IELTS proficiency evaluators to evaluate the proficiency after each session based on the narrations, those narrations I mentioned before of the cat and the bird. But in addition to that, we also picked up on analytical measures of fluency and complexity, no accuracy. And I can tell you about that later in the Q&A if you're interested. So we based our sessions on the Cambridge B2 Oral Proficiency Test. If you're familiar with it, you know that it does the sessions with 2 people. But then for the bit that we were interested in, the narrations, we did this individually. So for all of the sessions, we had 2 researchers on the Zooms and 2 participants. In some cases, it went down to 1, but most of them were 2. 45 to 60 minutes long, and everything was Zoom recorded. In terms of the objectives, the things that we were looking at, well, the first thing was, can we find a pattern between proficiency or linking proficiency and gesture? Can we see any patterns as our participants improve their proficiency? Do they change their gestures? Is there a difference in the gesture with familiarity? So obviously the first session where the participants didn't know us would be quite different from the last ones, in some cases after 6 sessions. When, bear in mind, this was done through COVID, and for quite a number of these participants, we were the only people that were speaking in English for almost a year. So they were keen to talk to us. We also looked at patterns in gesture with personality. And then finally, after the whole thing was over, we talked to our participants and we told them what the study had been really about because they didn't know, and asked for the perception of gesture. So we did interviews with them. So I'm going to go through this quite fast. The interesting bit is at the very end. In patterns in gesture by proficiency, the literature shows that there's been quite a number of studies on this. However, the results are inconclusive, which is hardly surprising because we're talking about different languages, we're talking about different cultures, the tasks are different. So yes, overall in interactions, there seem to be more iconical gestures and beats in higher proficiencies and lower ones, and fewer dictics. But as I said, there are so many differences that this is to be treated with a lot of caution. So what we did is when we finished the first sessions, we took all of the data from the first session and we analyzed it, and we were super happy thinking we'd find something. No correlation, just with proficiency. And we thought, okay, well, maybe subjective evaluations, let's look at the analytical measures. And we looked at them, and indeed there were some correlations. As you see, not very strong ones, but at least there was something. We went then to session 2, treated all the data independently, found again no relationship with proficiency, and none of the previous analytical measures were a match either. We found a couple of different ones, but no consistency. Again, with data from session 3, session 4, session 5. No, we can't find a correlation. And we found some very low effect ones with proficiency in session 4, but the results that we got actually contradict what all the studies have found. So we're treating it with a lot of caution. For me, this is a huge red flag for the gesture studies in second language acquisition. So we thought, okay, let's have a look at the differences in the same speaker, the first session, the last session. And this time we actually asked them to tell us exactly the same story, which they told us that they couldn't remember, which was a good thing. So we had done this previously with one person. So we had done this one pilot. And what we have found with him is that as his proficiency increased, there were fewer representational and deictic gestures. So fewer of these semantic gestures that are related with the semantic content of the speech. And overall, there were fewer gestures in English than in L1, in the L1 Cantonese. So, and you can read more about this in this article. So again, we looked at everything. Guess what? We couldn't find anything. We couldn't, there did not seem to be any patterns in change of proficiency with change of gesture. We thought, okay, maybe we're mixing up all the data that we have. Let's separate it. So we looked at those individuals who had improved and those individuals who had not improved, because we did actually have individuals who had not improved their proficiency. We thought, okay, maybe that's a problem. So amongst the ones who improved, we didn't find anything. The ones who didn't improve, yes, we found, that's the bits in yellow. We did find some significant results here, but we only had 16 individuals. So in terms of the statistical part here, I would treat this with a lot of caution. So what's happening here? What is the missing factor? There has to be something that we're not looking at. So we thought, okay, what about these ideas of familiarity, emotion, how engaged they are with us? So what we did is that we just looked at the gestures between sessions 1 and 4, where there have been very little proficiency change. And here we found that there were differences in the gestures. In particular, for those with a more pragmatic content, we found that discursive gestures had gone down, and the beats, those ones marking the stress, had gone up. So why, as our participants are more familiar with us, why are they using more beats? And then we also look at those non-gestures, and we also found that specifically adapters, continuous adapters, so those are the things, for example, when you're scratching yourself, this would be a continuous one rather than pushing your glasses. These ones were also going up. So what's happening? This sort of adapter is usually associated with anxiety. Now, by session 4, these guys knew me. I was a principal investigator. They knew me. They were familiar with me. They have been telling me all the problems. So why were they seemingly more anxious? And I'll tell you our thoughts at the end. And we also thought, okay, maybe personality is having an effect here. So personality is usually measured through the Big Five inventory. This is a test that that is considered reliable, has been replicated around the world, and it has identified 5 dimensions, 5 personality dimensions. So we thought, okay, we'll use this as well and see whether there are any correlations with the gestures. This has been done before in gesture studies. There's not too many studies on this, but it has been done before. And what they have found is that neuroticism, which is related to anxiety, it seems to be positively correlated with iconical gestures specifically. And also positively correlated with those adapters, fidgets, maybe those things that we're calling flatters, although the literature doesn't call them flatters. The other one, the other dimension that seems to be related as well to gestures is extraversion. So the idea is that more extroverted individuals gesture bigger, they gesture more frequently, they have, the theory says, more energy, and this is spent on gestures. Okay, so we looked at all of these, and we did not confirm previous studies again. Now, one of the things is that our classification of gesture was, as I mentioned at the beginning, a little bit different from what other studies have done. Many studies in the past have just focused on these symbolic gestures. I don't know whether metaphoric gestures were in there. Many of our discursive gestures were metaphoric. They did not carry semantic content, so this might be one of the reasons. But in this is quite a complex chart in terms of the information that is given. If you are really interested, go to the QR code, download the article. But basically, what we found is that there seemed to be more of a correlation with agreeableness. Now, one of the constructs of agreeableness is empathy. Empathy is a very complex construct, but we know about empathy in second language acquisition. It helps our learners if they have this empathy. So we, again, looked a little bit more into this. The other one that we found, the other dimension, was neuroticism. And with neuroticism, we found a relationship with the flatters, these little gestures that I was telling you about, and also with age. And what we think might be happening here is that as our participants were fairly young adults, many of them seem to be very self-conscious. And perhaps they were actually really trying to control the gestures. So they would try not to do this sort of thing. If they go into gesture, they will gesture. So then, when we talked about them after the study was over, we explored all of these ideas. And as I mentioned before, this idea of empathy, we were quite interested in it. So we found this study by Majors and his team, where he had actually developed a survey. He calls it the brief assessment of gestures, which he asked where he's trying to show that people who are more empathetic have are more attuned to gestures and have a better perception of gestures overall. So we thought, oh, that's quite interesting. We copied the questionnaire, and we also sent it to our participants after everything was finished. And then added a couple of questions which were related to the use of the gesture. So I don't know if you can actually see it because it's very, very small. The writing is quite small. But what we found, and then what we did is we asked our participants to think about these questions in Cantonese and in English, and how they would react in the situation Cantonese and in English. This is also a paper that is under revision at the moment, under review. So if anyone is interested, let me know. I'll be happy to share. And what we found is that there didn't seem to be that much difference between the Cantonese and the English, except that there seemed to be a slightly higher association of gestures with English than with Cantonese. So this is basically the three first red boxes that I have marked. you can see that the English answers are a little bit higher. And then when we asked them about the function of those gestures, they told us that cognitive and communicative, about 50% of our participants said cognitive, 52, there was an overlap, said communicative. Cognitive, they refer to finding the right word and also counting. Communicative, they were talking about engaging with the interlocutor, emphasizing content, clarifying a referent, and aiding a description. These were unprompted. They told us about these things. When we asked the open question, who do you gesture for? Do you gesture for yourself or do you do it for me, the interlocutor? So, the other thing we asked them is to estimate how much they gesture in English and Cantonese. And they thought overall that they gesture more in English. When we calculated the time, the percentage of the time spent gesturing, it was more or less the same. We have not yet calculated per syllable because we have a bit of an issue with the syllable count in Chinese, but we'll get there. And the other thing is that they way underestimated how much they gesture. So most of them will say, oh, I gesture 50% of the time. The average is closer to 90. Why do they gesture? Oh, let me come back. So the last red box in there, it says, I gesture to make an abstract idea more concrete. And if you see, this answer was given more in English than in Cantonese. So yes, it seems that our Cantonese speakers prefer to use representational gestures in English to help them in that thought process, to link the abstract with the concrete. And this links up with the results from previous studies where they find more iconic gestures in the L2 than the L1 in Mandarin speakers. Now, the other thing that I've mentioned before is that I believe that in more proficient speakers, that gesture thought speech I was telling you about at the beginning is stronger, is more developed. In learners, that unity might not have solidified, to call it, yet. And so the gestures that a learner might make do not always correspond with one salient idea, with the one salient idea of the thought. So they might give you 2 or 3 gestures, while a more proficient speaker might do just one gesture for the key point of that thought. Other things that they told us, in Cantonese, they knew more vocabulary, therefore they gestured more. However, as we see, there are fewer representational gestures in the L1 than the L2. So yeah, they might gesture more, but the gestures are not representational. They tend to be pragmatic, related to the discourse. They are more confident in Cantonese and produce more gestures, confidence, gestures. And the other thing is that because Cantonese was their L1, they thought that we expected a much better narration from them in Cantonese than in English. So they were more anxious. And that is why they produce more gestures. So anxiety gestures. We have two key ideas here related to emotion, anxiety and confidence, which might help us a little bit to explain some of the results that we have been seeing throughout the 3 years. But not the end of the story yet, because it turns out that the language itself is also carrying emotional content for these speakers. They believe that English allows them to express their emotions better, and that the language itself allows them to do that. And we wonder whether this comment is related to what I was saying to you at the beginning about the prosody of the languages. So is indeed English a better carrier of prosody because it allows stress that Cantonese doesn't? This is an area that needs to be looked into. There's a previous study by Stephen McCafferty and Tian who they were talking to the students Mandarin speakers who had gone to live in the US. And these students had also said that they found English a more emotional language than Cantonese. Here, I think there might also be a cultural element because they were in the US. And then a couple of our participants, but only a couple, said that they have more emotions in Cantonese. That's what they said. They have more emotions in Cantonese, and they were accompanied by gestures. Now, we didn't actually go into detail as to what these participants meant, but we wonder whether this might be in relation to the fact that in our L1 we feel our emotions stronger than in the L2. Cognitively, these emotions are formed much earlier, they are much stronger, so it would make sense. So to conclude, in addition to these factors that I have mentioned initially, can we add emotions to them? And we can add them at the cultural and language level, we can add them at the interlocutor task level, and we can also add them at this embodiment level. We learn as we experience the world around us, including the emotions related to these things. So that's it for me. I'm going to come back to the why do you gesture, but let me just say thank you to all of our participants, all of our student helpers, there were a lot of them as well, our 3 evaluators, our research assistants, and then to Dr. Simon Harrison from CityU, Professor Gail Stam and Professor Sotaro Pita for their help and advice. That's it.
Thank you so much, Renia, for such a wonderful talk. Now, I think we still have some time and open up for questions.